The Philippines, a land of lush forests, sprawling coastlines, and deep mountains, has been marked by the shadow of war for centuries. During World War II, this archipelago became a fierce battleground between the Japanese forces and the Allies, resulting in many tales of heroism, resistance, and inevitably loss. But what lingers beneath the soil, what haunts the forgotten trenches and abandoned bunkers, are not just memories of war, they are whispers of those who never left, voices that have been heard long after the gunfire ceased. This collection dives into the eerie echoes from the Philippine conflict, exploring haunted ruins, mysterious apparitions, and inexplicable phenomena that have been reported over the years. Story 1. The Sentry of Corregidor. The heavy mist drifted in from the sea, cloaking the island of Corregidor in a veil of gray. Located at the entrance of Manila Bay, Corregidor had long been a sentinel of the Philippines, standing guard against invaders. It was a key strategic point during World War II, a fortress that saw thousands of lost during fierce battles between the Allied and Japanese forces. Today, it was a tourist destination, a place for history buffs and those seeking to understand the past. But for some, Corregidor was not just a place to learn about history. It was a place where the past was still very much alive. I met Julio one rainy evening at a small bar near the docks, not far from where boats ferried tourists to and from the island. He was a man in his late 60s, with graying hair and a slight limp that hinted at an old injury. As a tour guide, Julio had spent decades recounting the island's storied past to visitors. But tonight, with the rain tapping gently against the windows and the distant hum of the ocean filling the air, he was willing to share a story that he rarely spoke about. "I've seen a lot in my years on that island," he began, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "But there's one thing I can't explain, one thing I don't tell the tourists." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes distant, as if seeing something I couldn't. I waited, letting the silence hang between us, until he finally continued. "It's about a sentry, a soldier who still stands guard in the dark, even though the war has been over for decades." Corregidor was once a labyrinth of tunnels, bunkers, and barracks, all connected by a complex network of underground passages. During the war, the most important of these was the Malinta Tunnel, a massive underground complex that served as a hospital, ammunition depot, and headquarters. It was there, Julio said, that people often reported seeing a ghostly figure, a lone sentry, dressed in a ragged, blood-stained uniform, his face pale and his eyes hollow. To understand the story of the sentry, Julio explained, you needed to know the history of the island. During the early months of 1942, Corregidor was the last Allied stronghold in the Philippines. After the fall of Bataan, the Japanese forces turned their full attention to the island, bombarding it relentlessly with artillery and air strikes. The soldiers stationed there were cut off from the rest of the world, their only hope being to hold out until reinforcements could arrive. The conditions in Malinta Tunnel were grim. It was dark, damp, and overcrowded, filled with the wounded and dying. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. The soldiers were exhausted, their faces hollow from hunger and stress, but they kept fighting, knowing that surrender meant certain death. Among the many stories of heroism and sacrifice, one stood out. The story of a young soldier named Private First Class David Reyes. David was barely 20 years old, a Filipino-American who had volunteered to join the army just months before the war began. He was stationed at Corregidor and was assigned to guard one of the entrances to the Malinta Tunnel. On the night of May 5, 1942, the Japanese launched their final assault on the island. They attacked under the cover of darkness, using small boats to land troops on the beaches. It was chaos. Explosions lit up the night, gunfire echoed across the island, and the air was filled with the screams of the wounded and dying. David was at his post when the attack began, standing guard as he had been ordered to do. He radioed for backup, but no one responded. The lines were down, and communication was impossible. He could have run, could have abandoned his post and sought shelter in the tunnels, but he didn't. Instead, he stood his ground, his rifle in hand, and watched as the enemy approached. They say he managed to take down several of the attackers before he was finally overpowered. His body was found the next morning, riddled with bullets but still standing, propped up against the wall as if he had died at attention. Over the years, visitors to the island have reported seeing a figure standing near the entrance to the Malinta Tunnel, especially late at night or early in the morning when the mist rolls in from the sea. He is always described the same way, a young man dressed in a tattered uniform with dark, hollow eyes. Some say they have seen him raise his arm in a salute before vanishing into the mist. Others have reported hearing faint whispers as if someone were calling for help, but when they turn around, there's no one there. Julio himself had seen the sentry once, many years ago. It was late, and he was closing up after a long day of guiding tourists through the tunnels. The last boat had left, and he was alone, making his way through the dark, winding corridors. As he passed the spot where David's body was found, he saw a figure standing in the shadows, barely visible in the dim light. "I thought it was one of the staff, maybe someone who had gotten lost," Julio said, his voice trembling slightly as he recalled the memory. "I called out, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me, and then he raised his arm and saluted." Julio paused, taking another sip of his drink. "I remember feeling this cold chill, like someone had walked over my grave. I blinked, and he was gone. I've never felt fear like that before, and I hope I never do again." In the late 1990s, a group of American tourists visited Corregidor, hoping to learn more about the role their country played in the war. They were a cheerful group, chatting and laughing as they made their way through the tunnels, guided by Julio. The tour was going smoothly until they reached the section where David's story was usually told. As Julio began to recount the tale, a thick fog started to seep into the tunnel, unusual for the time of year. The air grew colder, and the tourists fell silent, their laughter fading into uneasy murmurs. One of them, a middle-aged man named Peter, suddenly pointed to the end of the corridor. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Everyone turned to look, and there, barely visible through the mist, was the figure of a young man in a ragged uniform. He was standing at attention, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time had stopped, and they were all trapped in that moment, staring at a ghost from the past. The figure raised his arm, slowly, deliberately, and saluted. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving only the mist and the echo of a distant, haunting scream. The tourists were shaken, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Some tried to rationalize it, saying it must have been a trick of the light, but others were convinced they had seen something supernatural. Julio retired a few years later, but before he left, he visited the island one last time. He walked through the tunnels, paying his respects to the soldiers who had died there, and when he reached the spot where he had seen the sentry, he stood there for a long time, in silence. He felt a presence beside him, a familiar chill, but this time, it didn't scare him. "I think he just wanted someone to remember him," Julio said, his eyes misty as he finished his story. To acknowledge his sacrifice. He wasn't just a ghost, he was a soldier, standing guard even in death, and maybe, in that moment, he found the peace he was looking for. Corregidor Island is a place where history refuses to fade, where the past clings to the present like mist rolling in from the sea. The Sentry of Corregidor is more than just a ghost story. He is a reminder of the bravery and sacrifice of those who fought and died there, a symbol of a time when the world was at war, and the line between life and death was as thin as a whisper. As the boats continue to ferry tourists to and from the island, some may leave with only photographs and souvenirs, but others will leave with something more, a memory of a figure in the mist, saluting, standing guard, waiting for a relief that may never come. Story 2, The Lost Platoon of Mount Samat. I first heard this story from Armin, a retired soldier who had served in the Philippine military during the 1970s. We met at a reunion event for veterans, a gathering held in an old hall decorated with flags and medals, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and aged whiskey. As the night wore on, the conversations shifted from light-hearted tales of camaraderie to more solemn, haunting recollections. It was in this dimly lit room, surrounded by other men who had known the horrors of conflict, that Arman shared his account of the lost platoon of Mount Sama. Mount Samat is a place that commands reverence. During World War II, it was the site of one of the bloodiest and most desperate battles in the Pacific, the Battle of Bataan. When Allied forces were forced to retreat to the mountains, they dug in and fought against overwhelming odds. Today, the Dambana ng Kagatingan, Shrine of Valor, stands atop Mount Samat, a towering memorial dedicated to the courage and sacrifice of those soldiers. But there is another, darker legacy that lingers in the shadow of that monument, a legend that has been passed down among locals and soldiers alike. It was the late 1970s when Arman was stationed near Mount Samat as part of a routine patrol unit. His squad had been assigned to monitor the area around the foothills, which were overgrown with thick jungle, a place where visibility was poor and the air felt oppressively heavy. Though the war had been over for decades, the area still bore the scars of battle. Rusting tanks half buried in the underbrush, shattered bunkers hidden beneath vines, and unexploded ordnance waiting silently beneath the soil. Arman's patrol was relatively uneventful at first. They would spend days trekking through the dense jungle, setting up checkpoints and maintaining communication with nearby units. But one evening, as they prepared to settle down for the night, something strange happened. They heard the unmistakable sound of marching boots, a rhythmic, steady thudding that seemed to be coming from deeper within the forest. It was an odd sound, given that no other units were supposed to be in the area. "I remember thinking it must have been an echo, maybe from a distant village," Arman said, his hands trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette. But it wasn't. The sound was getting closer. Curiosity got the better of them, and Arman's unit decided to investigate. They moved quietly, weapons at the ready, following the sound deeper into the jungle. The air grew colder, and the once familiar trail seemed to twist and warp, leading them into a part of the forest they hadn't explored before. After about an hour of walking, they stumbled upon a path that was littered with debris, rusted helmets, broken rifles, and fragments of old, decaying uniforms. It was as if they had stepped into a forgotten battlefield. That's when they saw them. A group of soldiers moving through the trees in perfect unison. Their uniforms were old, tattered, and covered in mud, but it was clear that they were not from Arman's time. These men were from the past, their faces gaunt, their eyes empty, staring straight ahead as they marched. Arman and his men froze, watching in disbelief as the platoon passed by, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the still night air. "We called out to them," Arman said, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might bring the spirits back. But they didn't even flinch. They just kept marching, like they were heading somewhere important. Arman's story was not the first time the legend of the lost platoon had been told. Local villagers had their own version of the tale, passed down through generations. According to the old stories, during the final days of the Battle of Bataan, a platoon of Filipino and American soldiers had been ordered to hold a position on the slopes of Mount Samat. They were cut off from the main forces, surrounded by the enemy, but they refused to surrender. They fought to the last man, and when the fighting was over, their bodies were never recovered. Some say that the jungle claimed them, hiding their remains beneath the thick undergrowth, while others believe that their spirits continue to roam the mountain, eternally reliving their final march. There were even rumors that the spirits were searching for something, perhaps a way home, or a chance to finish a mission that had been lost to time. Arman and his men continued to follow the spectral soldiers, unsure whether they were hallucinating or experiencing something truly paranormal. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees leaning closer as if listening to the footsteps. Eventually, the ghostly platoon led them to a clearing near the summit of Mount Samat, where the Shrine of Valor stood tall, illuminated by the pale moonlight. The clearing was eerily quiet, except for the sound of the phantom march. As the platoon reached the edge of the clearing, they stopped, their eyes still fixed on the monument. For a brief moment, it was as if time had stood still, and Arman could see their faces clearly. Young, weary, yet determined, as if they were still waiting for orders that would never come. It was then that Arman noticed something strange on the ground. Scattered across the clearing were old, rusted dog tags, each one bearing a name. Some of the names were familiar to Arman. He had seen them inscribed on the memorial at the shrine. It was as if the earth had decided to give up its secrets, revealing the final resting place of these forgotten soldiers. The next morning, Armand's unit reported what they had seen to their superiors, but when they returned to the clearing, there was no sign of the ghostly platoon. The dog tags were still there, however, and they were collected and sent to the authorities, who confirmed that they belonged to soldiers who had been declared missing during the war. Despite the eerie encounter, no official explanation was ever given, and the incident was quietly forgotten. But the story didn't end there. Over the years, other patrols and tourists have reported similar sightings near Mount Samat. Some have seen the ghostly soldiers marching in the distance, while others have heard the faint sound of boots echoing through the trees, accompanied by the faint hum of a song that no one could quite place. Those who dared to follow the sound often found themselves lost, as if the jungle itself was trying to lead them astray. Years later, after he had retired from the military, Armand returned to Mount Samat. He wanted to pay his respects, to see if he could find some kind of closure for the experience that had haunted him for so long. He visited the Shrine of Valor, standing beneath the towering cross, and looked out over the vast green landscape below. As he stood there, he heard it again, the sound of marching boots, faint but unmistakable, drifting up from the forest. This time, he didn't try to follow it. Instead, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, hoping that the spirits of the lost platoon would find peace. He imagined them, still marching, still holding their rifles, their eyes fixed on a future they would never see. Mount Samat is a place of memory, a monument to the courage and sacrifice of those who fought in one of the most desperate battles of World War II. But for some, it is also a place of ghosts, where the past refuses to fade. The lost platoon continues to march, their boots echoing through the jungle, a reminder of lives cut short and missions left unfinished. The story of the lost platoon is not just a legend, it is a symbol of the enduring spirit of those who fought and died on the slopes of Mount Samat. They may be forgotten by history, their names lost to time, but their footsteps continue to be heard, a haunting echo of a conflict that shaped the future of a nation. If you ever find yourself near the foothills of Mount Samat and you hear the faint sound of marching in the distance, listen closely. It might be the wind, or it might be something else, something that has been marching for over 70 years, still searching for a way home. Story 3: Whispers in the Bataan Night. I learned of this chilling tale from a woman named Amelia, a schoolteacher who had grown up in the small town of Balanga, not far from the infamous road where the Bataan Death March took place. We met during a lecture at a local university, where I was presenting a talk on the psychological impact of wartime trauma. After my presentation, Amelia approached me, her face lined with age and a hint of melancholy. She said she had a story to tell, a story that her family had kept alive through whispers, one that had haunted her for as long as she could remember. The Bataan Death March is a dark chapter in the history of World War II. After the fall of Bataan in April 1942, approximately 75,000 Filipino and American soldiers were forced to march over 60 miles from Mariveles to San Fernando. With little food, water, or rest, thousands perished along the way, succumbing to exhaustion, starvation, and brutal treatment by their captors. The road became a graveyard, and the cries of the dying echoed through the forests long after the war had ended. Amelia's grandparents lived near one of the stopping points along this tragic route, and it was there, she said, that the whispers began. As a child, Amelia's grandmother would often warn her to stay away from the old road at night. That road, she would say, her voice trembling, is a place of sorrow. The dead still walk there, and they are not at peace. Amelia didn't understand what her grandmother meant, but she could sense the fear in her eyes. The warnings were always the same. Do not wander near the old road after sunset, and if you ever hear voices, do not respond. Amelia was a curious child, and as she grew older, she began to ask questions. What did her grandmother mean by the dead still walk? Why did she always insist on lighting candles by the window every night? But no one would give her a straight answer. Instead, they would change the subject or tell it was best not to ask such things. This only fueled her curiosity, and one evening, when she was about 12 years old, she decided to find out for herself. It was a humid summer evening, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. Amelia's grandparents had gone to bed early, as they often did, leaving the house silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. The old road was not far from their house, just a short walk through a narrow path that cut through the forest. Amelia grabbed a flashlight, slipped on her sandals, and quietly crept out of the house. The path to the road was overgrown with weeds, and the trees seemed to close in around her as she made her way through the darkness. She could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, and the distant croak of frogs. It was a familiar sound, one that had always brought her comfort, but tonight it felt different. Darker, as if the forest was holding its breath. When she finally reached the road, she was surprised by how still everything was. The moon was full, casting a pale, ghostly light on the cracked asphalt, and for a moment, Amelia thought she had been foolish to come. There was nothing here, just an empty road leading to nowhere. She turned to leave, but then she heard it, a faint, whispering sound, like the wind carrying voices that were not there. At first she thought it was just her imagination, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. She couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the desperation in the voices. Some were pleading, others were weeping, and a few seemed to be singing a soft, mournful tune. Amelia's heart began to race as she scanned the darkness, her flashlight flickering as if struggling to stay alive. That's when she saw them, shadowy figures moving slowly along the road, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. Amelia froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figures were moving in a line, just as the soldiers had during the death march, their heads bowed, their movements slow and laborious. She could see their outlines, men in tattered uniforms, some with bandages around their heads, others with their arms slung in makeshift slings. They were shuffling along as if weighed down by an invisible burden, and as they passed, Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to scream, to run back to the safety of her house, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, unable to look away as the shadows continued their silent march. Then, one of the figures stopped and turned to face her. For a moment, their eyes met, and Amelia felt a wave of sorrow wash over her, a grief so intense that she thought her heart might break. The figure raised a hand as if to reach out to her and whispered something she couldn't quite hear. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving her standing alone on the road, the night once again silent. Amelia ran home, her mind reeling with what she had just witnessed. She burst through the door, startling her grandmother, who was sitting by the window, her eyes wide with fear. "I told you not to go," she said, her voice shaking. "They don't want to be disturbed." It was then that Amelia learned the truth about the whispers. Her grandmother had lived through the Bataan Death March, though she had been just a child at the time. She remembered watching from the safety of her home as the soldiers passed by, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Some had collapsed on the road, too weak to continue, and were left behind to die. Others had whispered prayers, calling out for help that never came. Amelia's grandmother had never forgotten those faces, nor the whispers that haunted the road long after the soldiers were gone. "They're still here," she said, her eyes distant as if seeing something far away. "They're still marching, still crying out. They want to be remembered." Over the years, Amelia's family had tried to honor the spirits of the soldiers who had died along the road. They would light candles on the anniversary of the march, leaving offerings of food and water by the roadside, hoping to bring some comfort to the restless souls. But no matter how many prayers they said, the whispers never stopped. Some nights, Amelia would lie awake in her bed, listening to the faint, distant voices, and wonder if they would ever find peace. Amelia's experience that night left her shaken, and she never ventured near the old road again. But the whispers followed her, haunting her dreams, filling her with a sense of sadness that she couldn't explain. She would see the faces of the soldiers, their eyes pleading, their hands reaching out for something just out of reach, and she knew, deep down, that they were still searching for a way to be heard, a way to be remembered. Years later, after her grandparents had passed away, Amelia decided to return to Balanga. She had moved to the city, but she never forgot the whispers, and she felt a strange compulsion to go back, as if something was calling her. She visited the old road, now partially reclaimed by the forest, and stood there, listening to the wind. The air was cool, and for a moment she felt a sense of calm. She brought with her a small lantern, a family heirloom that her grandmother used to light every night, and set it down by the roadside. She lit the flame and whispered a prayer, not just for the soldiers who had died, but for all those who had suffered during the war. She asked for forgiveness, for peace, and for the whispers to finally fade. For a long time she stood there, waiting. The forest was quiet, and she could hear her own heartbeat, steady and calm. And then, faintly, she heard the voices again, but this time they were different. They were softer, gentler, as if thanking her. The shadows did not appear, but she felt their presence, a subtle, comforting warmth that seemed to wrap around her. The Bataan Death March is a story of unimaginable suffering, a testament to the horrors of war. The whispers that echo along the old road are a reminder of the pain that lingers long after the guns fall silent. Amelia's story is one of many, a glimpse into a past that refuses to be forgotten. The road may have changed, and the forest may have grown over the old scars, but the memories remain, carried on the wind like whispers in the night. If you ever find yourself walking along the old road near Balanga, and you hear a faint, distant murmur, listen closely. It may be the wind, or it may be the echoes of those who once marched there, still searching for the peace that eluded them in life. Light a candle, say a prayer, and remember them. Perhaps in doing so, you might bring a little comfort to those restless souls and help the whispers finally fade into the night. Story 4. The Lady of Fort Santiago. Fort Santiago stands as one of Manila's most significant historical landmarks. Its imposing stone walls have witnessed centuries of conflict, from the Spanish colonization to the American and Japanese occupations. Located by the mouth of the Pasig River, it served as a military fortress, a prison, and a place of execution. Today, it is a popular tourist destination, a quiet park where visitors can explore the ruins and learn about the country's tumultuous history. Yet beneath the cobblestone paths and well-tended gardens lies a darker story, one of lingering spirits and unquiet ghosts. I first heard the story of the Lady of Fort Santiago from a friend named Miguel, who had worked as a caretaker at the fort for several years. We met during a guided night tour, which had been organized for a small group of history enthusiasts. After the tour ended, Miguel and I shared a few drinks at a nearby cafe, and as the evening grew darker, he began to speak of things that weren't on the official tour script. Things that most visitors never knew. He warned me that the fort, though beautiful during the day, was a very different place at night, and then he shared the story of the lady. It was late one evening, Miguel said, when he had his first encounter with the lady. The tourists had long since left, and he was making his final rounds, locking up the gates and checking the grounds. As he walked along the old stone walls, he felt a sudden chill in the air, an unnatural cold that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He stopped and looked around, but there was no one there. The fort was silent, the only sound the distant lapping of the river against the shore. That's when he saw her, a woman standing near the entrance to the dungeons, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She was dressed in a white, tattered gown that flowed around her like mist, her long, dark hair cascading down to her waist. At first, Miguel thought she was a tourist who had gotten lost, but as he approached her, he realized something was terribly wrong. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were dark, hollow, as if they had seen too much. She was humming softly, a mournful tune that echoed through the empty fort, and as he got closer, she slowly turned her head to look at him. For a moment, their eyes met, and Miguel felt a wave of sorrow wash over him, a grief so intense that it nearly brought him to his knees. He wanted to speak, to ask her who she was, but his voice caught in his throat. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, fading into the shadows without a sound. To understand the lady's story, Miguel explained, you needed to know the history of Fort Santiago, especially during the Japanese occupation in World War II. The fort was used as a prison for Filipino and American soldiers, as well as civilians suspected of aiding the resistance. Many were tortured, interrogated, and executed within its walls. The dungeons, in particular, were notorious for their brutality. Prisoners were crammed into tiny, airless cells, left to suffer in the darkness, with no hope of escape. But the lady was not one of the soldiers. According to the legend, she was a young woman named Rosa, who lived in Manila during the war. Her fiancé was a member of the resistance, and she would secretly pass messages between him and his comrades. One day, she was caught by Japanese soldiers while delivering a message, and they brought her to Fort Santiago for questioning. She was tortured, but she refused to reveal anything about the resistance, even when they threatened to kill her. In the end, she was executed, her body left in one of the dungeons. It was said that she died still holding the message, refusing to let it fall into enemy hands. After the war, her story became one of many tragic tales associated with the fort, a symbol of the courage and sacrifice of those who fought against oppression. But while most moved on, it seemed that Rosa's spirit could not. Over the years, many visitors to Fort Santiago have reported seeing a mysterious woman in white wandering the grounds, especially near the dungeons. Some have seen her standing by the entrance, while others have heard her soft, mournful humming echoing through the corridors. A few have even claimed to have seen her inside the dungeons, her figure barely visible in the dim light, as if she were waiting for someone who would never come. One such encounter was recounted by a young woman named Carla, who visited the fort with her family during a historical tour. They had just finished exploring the Rizal Shrine and were about to leave when Carla decided to take a quick walk around the grounds. As she passed by the entrance to the dungeons, she heard a faint sound, like someone humming a lullaby. She turned and saw a woman standing in the shadows, her face partially obscured by her hair. Carla thought she was another tourist, but as she stepped closer, she realized there was something strange about her. The woman's dress was old-fashioned, torn and stained, and her eyes seemed to glisten with unshed tears. She smiled sadly at Carla and began to hum again, the melody filling the air with a haunting, melancholic beauty. Carla wanted to ask her who she was, but before she could speak, the woman turned and disappeared into the dungeon, leaving nothing but silence behind. When Carla mentioned the encounter to the tour guide, she was met with a knowing smile. "You're not the first to see her," the guide said. "She's been here for a long time." Miguel had another encounter with the lady a few months after the first. This time, it was during a particularly stormy night, when the winds howled through the fort, like the cries of 1,000 lost souls. He was once again making his rounds, checking to make sure the gates were secure when he heard the faint sound of singing. It was the same song he had heard before, the same haunting lullaby that had filled him with an inexplicable sadness. He followed the sound, which led him to the entrance of the dungeons. There, he saw the lady again, standing in the rain, her gown billowing around her like mist. She was singing softly, her voice carrying over the wind, and as he listened, he realized that the song was not just a melody, it was a plea, a lament for something lost. He felt drawn to her, compelled to understand what she was trying to say, but he knew better than to approach her this time. Instead, he simply stood there, listening, letting the sorrowful notes wash over him. The song ended abruptly, and the lady turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken pain. For a moment, Miguel thought he saw a flash of recognition in her eyes, as if she knew who he was, or perhaps she was seeing someone else entirely. Then, without a word, she faded into the shadows once more, leaving him alone in the rain. There are many theories about who the Lady of Fort Santiago might be. Some believe she is indeed Rosa, the young woman who was executed for her role in the resistance. Others think she could be one of the countless prisoners who died in the dungeons, a spirit too traumatized to move on. There are even those who suggest that she is a composite of several different women, each one bearing her own story of suffering and loss. One of the more intriguing theories comes from an old journal that was found during a restoration of the fort in the 1980s. The journal belonged to a Japanese officer who had been stationed there during the war, and it contained detailed accounts of the interrogations he conducted. One entry, dated a few days before the liberation of Manila, mentioned a woman in white who was brought in for questioning. The officer described her as defiant, and noted that she refused to speak, even under threat of death. The entry ends abruptly, with a single line, "She sang even as we took her away." Years passed, and Miguel continued to work at the fort, though he rarely spoke of his encounters with the lady. But there was one final moment that he shared with me, one that he said he would never forget. It was late one afternoon, just before the fort closed for the day, and Miguel was walking along the old stone walls, lost in thought. As he approached the dungeons, he felt that familiar chill, and he knew she was there. This time, she was not humming or singing. She was standing by the entrance, looking out at the river, her hands clasped in front of her. Miguel felt a strange sense of calm as he approached her, and for the first time, he found the courage to speak. "What do you want?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The lady turned to him, her eyes dark and sad, and for a moment Miguel thought he saw a tear glisten on her cheek. She raised a hand, as if reaching out to him, and then she spoke, her voice soft and distant, like a breeze. "Remember us," she said. "Do not forget." Then she was gone, leaving Miguel standing there, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting long shadows across the fort. He never saw her again after that, but he continued to work there for a few more years, always making sure to leave a candle burning near the entrance to the dungeons, a small act of remembrance for a woman whose story had been lost to time. Fort Santiago is more than just a historical site. It is a place where the past lingers, where the walls remember the stories of those who suffered within them. The Lady of Fort Santiago is one of those stories, a ghost who walks the line between memory and myth, reminding us of a time when Manila was gripped by fear and conflict. Whether she is a real spirit or simply a manifestation of the fort's dark history, her presence is a testament to the resilience of those who dared to resist, even when faced with insurmountable odds. If you ever visit Fort Santiago and you find yourself walking near the dungeons, listen closely. You might hear the faint sound of a lullaby carried on the wind, or catch a glimpse of a woman in white standing by the entrance. If you do, don't be afraid. Just remember her and say a silent prayer for all those who never got the chance to see the end of the war. Perhaps in that small act of remembrance, you can help the lady find the peace she has been searching for. The Philippines is a land that remembers, a place where the past is never truly forgotten. The spirits of war still roam its jungles, its tunnels, and its roads, a reminder of the pain and sacrifice that once stained its soil. Whether these stories are real or simply the result of overactive imaginations is a question that may never be answered. But one thing is certain, the echoes of the past continue to haunt those who dare to listen. If you have ever experienced a brush with the paranormal, especially in places marked by war, share your story. Perhaps there are more echoes waiting to be heard, more phantoms still wandering, searching for the peace that eluded them in life.